From the earliest days of American history, people living on this continent have wrestled with questions that go far beyond laws, wars, and borders. Alongside the drafting of constitutions and the settling of frontiers, there has always been a quieter debate about the nature of the soul, the persistence of memory, and whether a life truly ends when the body does. In the same way that Puritan sermons once warned of eternal consequences and transcendentalists later spoke of an enduring spirit, stories of reincarnation have surfaced again and again, challenging accepted ideas of time and identity. These accounts, drawn from different eras and communities, do not read like folklore alone but often intersect with documented lives, recorded statements, and verifiable details that raise uncomfortable and fascinating questions. One such story emerged in the early 20th century, when a young child in the American Midwest began speaking of places and people far removed from the family's experience. The child described a small town, named its streets, and recalled a fatal accident involving farm equipment. When researchers later compared these statements with county records from decades earlier, the accident, the names, and even the layout of the town matched a real event involving a man who had died long before the child's birth. In a nation that prides itself on written records and local archives, the alignment between memory and documentation gave the story unusual weight. Another account surfaced during the Great Depression, a time when Americans were already questioning the stability of life itself. A boy in New York repeatedly spoke of being a soldier who had fought in a previous war, describing uniforms, weapons, and battlefield conditions in striking detail. Veterans who heard these descriptions noted their accuracy, particularly regarding lesser-known practices that were not commonly depicted in newspapers or films of the era. When historians cross-checked military roles, they found a soldier whose experiences mirrored the child's claims almost point for point, including a fatal wound that matched a birthmark on the child's body. In the South, where oral tradition has long preserved family histories alongside official narratives, a young girl in the 1950s spoke of having lived as an enslaved woman before emancipation. She described daily labor, the layout of a plantation, and the sound of Union troops arriving. Local historians initially dismissed the claims, yet curiosity led them to compare the descriptions with plantation records and diaries. The names she mentioned, once obscure, appeared in faded ledgers, and the events she recalled matched a specific plantation's history, offering a haunting reminder of how personal memory and national history might intertwine. On the West Coast, a story arose during the post-war boom when scientific optimism dominated public thought. A child in California insisted on having been a pilot who died in an aircraft crash during World War II. The child identified the model of the plane, the aircraft carrier from which it launched, and the circumstances of the crash. Naval records later confirmed the loss of a pilot under nearly identical conditions. For a country that meticulously documents its military history, the precision of these recollections challenged the assumption that memory is confined to a single lifetime. Another account crossed cultural boundaries during the Civil Rights era. A boy from an urban neighborhood spoke of living a previous life as a farmer in a rural area hundreds of miles away. He described specific tools, crops, and seasonal routines unfamiliar to his family. When taken to the region he described, he reportedly identified landmarks and a farmhouse that no longer stood, its foundation still visible. County land deeds confirmed the existence of the farm and its former owner, whose life story bore striking similarities to the child's narrative. In New England, where colonial history is deeply embedded in town halls and gravestones, a child in the 1970s spoke of having lived during the Revolutionary War. The child described marching routes, the sound of muskets, and the fear felt before battle. These descriptions aligned closely with first-hand accounts preserved in letters from the era. When visiting a historic battlefield, the child reportedly recognized specific locations without prior exposure, adding another layer of intrigue to an already well-documented chapter of American history. One of the most discussed cases among researchers occurred in the late 20th century and involved detailed recollections of a previous life that included a full name, occupation, and cause of death. Investigators verified the existence of a person matching the description, including the circumstances of death. The overlap between remembered details and public records was so extensive that it drew the attention of psychologists, historians, and journalists alike, blurring the line between anecdote and evidence. In the Southwest, where indigenous traditions have long spoken of cyclical existence, a child described memories that aligned with tribal history rather than family background. Elders recognized the accuracy of ceremonies and customs mentioned, some of which were no longer widely practiced. This case stood out not only for its detail, but also for how it echoed beliefs held long before the arrival of European settlers, suggesting that ideas of rebirth may have persisted beneath the surface of mainstream American culture. Another story unfolded in a military family, where a child spoke of having lived as a sailor who never returned from sea. The child described the interior of a ship and the sensation of drowning with unsettling clarity. Naval historians later confirmed the sinking of a vessel matching the description, along with the loss of a crew member whose background aligned with the memories described. In a nation shaped by maritime exploration and conflict, such accounts resonated deeply. Perhaps most striking was a case involving multiple witnesses and extensive documentation. A child consistently recalled events from a previous life, including personal relationships and unfinished business. When investigators located the family connected to those memories, surviving relatives confirmed details that had never been made public. Letters, photographs, and official documents corroborated the timeline, leaving even skeptics to acknowledge the unusual convergence of memory and history. Together, these stories occupy a curious place within the broader narrative of American history. They do not fit neatly into textbooks or timelines, yet they persist alongside wars, migrations, and political movements. In a country built on the idea of progress and the forward march of time, accounts of reincarnation invite a different perspective, one that suggests history may not only be something recorded in books and archives, but also something carried, consciously or not, from one generation to another, living quietly beneath the surface of everyday life. From the earliest colonial settlements to the rise of a modern nation, Americans have consistently asked questions that reach beyond politics and economics and into the deeper meaning of human existence. Long before the United States was formally established, European settlers arrived carrying religious traditions that emphasized the immortality of the soul, divine judgment, and life beyond the physical world. Puritan sermons echoed through meeting houses, warning that earthly actions carried eternal consequences, while diaries and letters from the colonial era reveal private reflections on death, salvation, and what might follow the grave. These early beliefs laid a foundation for a uniquely American habit of blending spiritual inquiry with everyday life, making questions about the soul not abstract philosophy but a lived concern shared across generations. As the colonies grew and eventually broke from British rule, the language of destiny and purpose became central to the American identity. Revolutionary leaders often framed independence not only as a political necessity, but as part of a larger moral order. The idea that history itself moved according to higher principles encouraged people to think of human life as connected to something enduring. Even as the new republic emphasized reason and Enlightenment ideals, interest in the soul did not disappear. Instead, it adapted, finding expression in debates about natural rights, human dignity, and the inherent worth of the individual, all of which implied that human existence held value beyond a single lifespan. During the 19th century, waves of religious revival known as the Great Awakenings swept across the country, reigniting public fascination with spiritual matters. Camp meetings drew thousands, and preachers spoke passionately about the journey of the soul, personal transformation, and life after death. At the same time, new movements emerged that challenged traditional doctrines. Transcendentalists argued that the soul was part of a larger universal spirit, capable of growth and continuity beyond physical boundaries. Spiritualist gatherings, popular especially in the mid-1800s, claimed communication with the dead, reflecting a widespread belief that death did not sever consciousness but altered its form. These movements showed that Americans were not satisfied with rigid answers and were willing to explore alternative explanations for the persistence of the self. The trauma of the Civil War intensified these questions on an unprecedented scale. With hundreds of thousands dead, nearly every family confronted loss directly. Letters from soldiers and civilians alike express a desperate longing to believe that loved ones continued to exist in some meaningful way. Photographs of the fallen were kept close, and stories of visions, dreams, and sensed presences circulated widely. In this atmosphere, the notion that the soul might survive death, or even return in another form, offered a measure of comfort. While reincarnation was not a mainstream belief, the broader idea that life extended beyond a single physical existence became deeply rooted in the national consciousness. As the United States entered the industrial age, scientific progress began to reshape how Americans understood the world. Advances in medicine, psychology, and technology promised rational explanations for phenomena once attributed to the spiritual realm. Yet rather than eliminating questions about the soul, science often reframed them. Psychologists studied memory, consciousness, and identity, while philosophers debated whether the mind could be fully explained by the brain alone. Reports of unusual memories, especially among children, were sometimes investigated with the same seriousness as other psychological phenomena. This period revealed a uniquely American tension between skepticism and openness, where empirical inquiry coexisted with a willingness to consider ideas that lay beyond conventional science. The 20th century, marked by global wars and rapid social change, further complicated the American view of life and death. Soldiers returned from battlefields with stories of near-death experiences, and families struggled to make sense of sudden, massive loss. At the same time, the country's increasing cultural diversity introduced ideas from Eastern philosophies, including more explicit concepts of rebirth and cyclical existence. These beliefs did not remain isolated within immigrant communities but gradually entered popular discourse through literature, academic study, and public conversation. Americans, long accustomed to blending influences, absorbed these ideas into an existing framework of spiritual curiosity. Throughout these shifts, one theme remained constant: a deep concern with personal identity and continuity. The American emphasis on individualism made the question of what happens to the self after death especially pressing. If a person's character, memories, and moral choices define who they are, then the possibility that these elements might persist challenges the assumption that identity ends at the grave. Stories suggesting that memories could cross the boundary between lives struck at the heart of this concern, prompting both fascination and discomfort. They raised questions about responsibility, justice, and the meaning of experience in a society built on the idea of self-made lives. In classrooms, churches, and private homes, discussions about the soul continued, often shaped by current events and cultural shifts. The civil rights movement, with its emphasis on human dignity and shared humanity, encouraged broader thinking about what connects people across time and circumstance. Indigenous perspectives, long marginalized, began to receive greater recognition, bringing with them traditions that viewed life as cyclical rather than linear. These viewpoints challenged dominant narratives and suggested that the American story itself might be part of a larger, ongoing human journey rather than a single isolated chapter. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the question of the soul had become both deeply personal and widely debated. Media coverage of unusual cases, academic research into consciousness, and renewed interest in spirituality ensured that the topic remained alive. What distinguished the American approach was not blind acceptance or outright rejection, but an ongoing negotiation between belief, evidence, and experience. This balance reflected the nation's broader character, shaped by freedom of thought, religious pluralism, and a historical willingness to question established truths. Across centuries of change, from colonial sermons to modern psychological studies, the question of whether life extends beyond a single existence has never fully faded from American thought. It has evolved, taking new forms and language, but it remains rooted in the same fundamental curiosity that drove early settlers to search their souls and later generations to probe the limits of memory and identity. This enduring question, woven quietly through the fabric of U.S. history, continues to invite reflection on whether the story of a life is truly confined to one beginning and one end throughout American history. The nation's reliance on written records, official documentation, and verifiable evidence has shaped how stories are judged and remembered. Birth certificates, military rosters, census lists, land deeds, and newspaper archives form the backbone of the country's historical memory. Within this culture of documentation, reincarnation accounts have attracted unusual attention when they intersect with tangible historical facts. Unlike folklore passed down through generations, some stories stand out because individuals describe names, dates, places, and events that later align with archived records, creating a tension between personal memory and established timelines. During the early 20th century, when local newspapers were the primary chroniclers of community life, several reported cases involved children recounting specific incidents that had occurred decades earlier. In small towns where records were meticulously preserved, families and historians compared these statements with old articles and legal documents. In certain instances, details about fatal accidents, obscure professions, or long-forgotten residents matched information buried in county files. The accuracy of these claims surprised investigators not because of their emotional content, but because they aligned with verifiable facts that were unlikely to have been discovered through casual exposure. Military history has provided some of the most compelling intersections between reincarnation claims and documented evidence. The United States maintains extensive archives of service records, battle reports, and casualty lists dating back to the Revolutionary War. When individuals described previous lives as soldiers, historians often checked these records to assess the validity of the claims. Accounts involving detailed descriptions of uniforms, training procedures, or specific military units occasionally matched archival data. In a few cases, individuals provided names or locations that corresponded to actual soldiers who had died under similar circumstances, reinforcing the perception that these stories were not merely imaginative narratives, but reflections of something more complex. Local history has also played a significant role in verifying unusual memories. County courthouses across the country maintain property records and legal documents stretching back generations.
So glad you could join us.
When individuals described former homes,
family.
businesses, or community events that predated their birth, researchers sometimes compared these recollections with archived maps and land ownership records. Instances where street layouts, family names, or property details aligned with historical documents gave rise to debates among historians and psychologists about how such information could have been obtained without prior knowledge. The growth of modern journalism in the mid-20th century added another layer of scrutiny to these stories. Reporters trained in investigative techniques sought to confirm or debunk claims by interviewing witnesses, examining archives, and cross-referencing timelines. Articles often presented both skeptical and supportive perspectives, reflecting the broader American tradition of balancing curiosity with critical analysis. Cases that withstood journalistic investigation gained wider attention, especially when multiple sources confirmed the accuracy of specific details mentioned in the recollections. Academic research also contributed to the conversation. Universities and independent researchers began collecting accounts that included verifiable historical elements. Instead of focusing solely on the emotional or spiritual aspects, they emphasized measurable data such as documented events, recorded deaths, and physical locations. Some studies compiled extensive files comparing statements made by individuals with historical records, noting instances where precise information appeared without a clear source of exposure. These efforts did not claim to prove reincarnation definitively, but highlighted the unusual consistency between certain memories and established historical facts. Cultural diversity within the United States further influenced how these stories were received and documented. Immigrant communities often maintained their own historical archives, including church records, oral histories, and cultural registries. When individuals from these communities described past lives tied to specific cultural events or traditions, researchers compared their statements with community records. In some cases, rituals, language patterns, or historical incidents described matched those preserved in local archives, adding complexity. Technological advancements in the late 20th century transformed the process of verification. Digital databases allowed researchers to access census records, military archives, and newspaper collections more efficiently than ever before. Information that once required months of travel and manual searching could now be cross-referenced in hours. This accessibility led to renewed interest in cases where detailed recollections aligned with documented history. Online archives made it easier to test claims objectively, encouraging both believers and skeptics to engage with the evidence. Legal documentation also played a role in certain cases. Death certificates, autopsy reports, and court records provided concrete details that could be compared with personal recollections. When individuals described the manner or circumstances of a previous death, researchers examined these official documents for similarities. In rare situations, physical characteristics such as birthmarks were compared with medical reports from deceased individuals, prompting further investigation into possible connections between past events and present experiences. The American emphasis on transparency and public access to information has meant that many of these stories unfolded in open forums rather than private circles. Television interviews, documentaries, and public lectures introduced audiences to cases where memories and historical data overlapped. Viewers often saw side-by-side comparisons of statements and archival documents, reinforcing the sense that the stories existed within the same evidentiary framework as other historical claims. Public reaction ranged from fascination to skepticism, yet the discussions underscored the importance of documentation in shaping how such stories were perceived. Critics have argued that coincidences, subconscious learning, or exposure to media could explain many of these cases. The existence of extensive records means that determined individuals might uncover historical details and incorporate them into personal narratives, intentionally or unintentionally. Supporters, however, point to instances where information appeared too obscure or specific to have been easily discovered, especially when individuals were very young or had limited access to historical materials. The ongoing debate reflects a broader American tendency to weigh evidence carefully while remaining open to unconventional possibilities, in a nation built on the belief that history can be preserved through documents and archives. Stories that intersect with verifiable records carry a particular resonance. They challenge the assumption that historical knowledge is confined to books and official sources, suggesting that memory itself might play an unexpected role in preserving the past. Whether interpreted as psychological phenomena, cultural storytelling, or evidence of something beyond current understanding, these accounts occupy a unique space where personal experience meets documented history, inviting continued examination and discussion throughout American history. Children have often been seen as symbols of new beginnings, blank slates shaped by education, family, and social environment. The prevailing belief has long held that knowledge grows with age and experience, that memory accumulates gradually through schooling and observation. Against this backdrop, stories in which young children demonstrate detailed knowledge of past events, unfamiliar places, or specialized skills have been especially unsettling. When children speak with confidence about lives that appear to predate their own, their age and limited exposure become central to why such accounts capture public attention. In the early 20th century, developmental psychology in the United States emphasized the stages of childhood learning, mapping how language, reasoning, and memory typically unfold. Within this framework, children were expected to acquire information through direct teaching or imitation. Yet some reported cases challenged these assumptions by presenting children who described complex adult experiences, such as occupations, travel routes, or historical events, with specificity beyond what their families could explain. Researchers and journalists alike noted that the youth of the individuals involved made simple explanations less satisfying, as the children lacked both the opportunity and motivation to fabricate such intricate narratives. American society has traditionally placed great trust in childhood innocence, a belief reinforced through literature, education, and law. Children are often viewed as less capable of deception, particularly when very young. This cultural perception amplified the impact of cases where children persistently repeated the same accounts over long periods, even when met with confusion or dismissal by adults. In many instances, children expressed frustration at not being believed, insisting on the reality of their memories, without apparent gain or encouragement. This consistency over time strengthened the impression that something more than imagination was at work. The educational environment further highlights the anomaly of these accounts. Schools introduce history gradually, beginning with simplified narratives and advancing toward complexity as students mature. When children with limited schooling referenced historical details not yet taught, such as specific military units, outdated technologies, or regional customs, educators were often among the first to question how such knowledge was acquired. In some cases, teachers documented these statements before families became aware of their potential significance, providing independent records that later investigations could reference. Family dynamics also play a crucial role in understanding why children are viewed as unexpected carriers of historical memory. Parents are usually acutely aware of the media their children consume, the stories told within the household, and the experiences available to them. When parents reported that certain details had never been discussed or encountered, their testimony added credibility to the claims. Particularly compelling were situations in which families initially discouraged the narratives, hoping the child would abandon them, only to find that the memories persisted or became more detailed over time. Psychologists studying these cases often focused on the emotional tone with which children shared their experiences. Unlike fictional storytelling, which tends to shift with mood or audience, many children described past life memories in a matter-of-fact manner, sometimes accompanied by strong emotions such as fear, grief, or longing. Nightmares, phobias, or intense attachments connected to the described memories were also reported, suggesting an emotional depth not typically associated with imaginative play. These emotional responses raised questions about the source of such feelings in children who had not encountered the triggering experiences in their current lives. The American legal system's approach to child testimony offers another lens through which these stories have been examined. While courts recognize that children's memories can be influenced, they also acknowledge that children can recall events with striking accuracy, particularly when those events are emotionally significant. This dual understanding has informed how investigators approach reincarnation accounts, balancing caution with openness. In some documented cases, independent witnesses recorded children's statements before any verification process began, reducing the likelihood that information was shaped by later discoveries. Cultural expectations about childhood imagination often lead skeptics to dismiss unusual claims as fantasy. However, imagination typically draws on familiar elements from a child's environment, reworking known stories or characters. In contrast, some accounts involve obscure historical facts or culturally specific practices unfamiliar to the child's surroundings. When children accurately described tools, rituals, or social customs from different eras or regions, researchers struggled to identify plausible sources for such knowledge, especially when access to books, media, or travel was limited. Over time, patterns began to emerge across multiple cases. Children often started speaking about these memories at a very young age, sometimes as soon as they developed language skills. The recollections tended to fade as the children grew older, coinciding with increased immersion in their present lives and identities. This pattern suggested a developmental window during which such memories, whatever their origin, were more accessible. The temporary nature of these experiences further distinguished them from learned behaviors or deliberate fabrication. Public reaction to these stories has reflected broader American attitudes toward mystery and explanation. Media coverage frequently highlighted the age of the children involved, emphasizing their apparent lack of motive and opportunity to deceive. Documentaries and interviews often contrasted the simplicity of a child's life with the complexity of the memories described, inviting audiences to consider explanations beyond conventional learning. At the same time, critics cautioned against romanticizing such accounts, urging careful analysis to avoid projecting adult interpretations onto childhood behavior. The role of children in this narratives ultimately challenges fundamental assumptions about memory, learning, and identity. If children can express detailed knowledge without clear exposure, it raises questions about where memory resides and how it is accessed. Even without accepting reincarnation as an explanation, these cases prompt reconsideration of how much of human experience is consciously acquired, and how much may lie beneath awareness. Within the American context, where education, self-determination, and personal history are highly valued, the idea that children might carry fragments of the past in unexpected ways continues to provoke curiosity, debate, and reflection. Vast geographic and cultural diversity of the United States has always shaped how ideas about life, death, and renewal are understood. From coastal cities influenced by global trade to rural communities rooted in long-standing traditions, beliefs about existence have evolved differently across regions while still influencing one another. Within this varied landscape, stories of reincarnation appear not as isolated curiosities, but as narratives that surface in many corners of American society, reflecting the country's complex blend of cultures, histories, and belief systems. In the Midwest, where communities often emphasize continuity, family history, and connection to the land, reincarnation stories have sometimes been interpreted through the lens of generational memory. Farming families, accustomed to tracing property and lineage through decades, are particularly attuned to the idea that the past remains present. When children in these regions speak of prior lives tied to specific farms or towns, their stories resonate with local traditions that honor ancestry and stewardship. The familiarity with preserving records and oral histories creates an environment where such accounts are carefully examined rather than immediately dismissed. The American South presents a different cultural context shaped by deep historical roots, oral storytelling, and the lingering presence of unresolved pasts. Stories of reincarnation emerging from this region often intersect with themes of memory, loss, and identity, tied to slavery, war, and social transformation. In communities where history is felt as much as it is studied, accounts of individuals recalling lives from earlier generations can be seen as expressions of collective memory. The persistence of family stories passed down through generations makes the idea of lives echoing across time feel less abstract and more emotionally grounded. In the Northeast, where colonial history and revolutionary heritage are physically embedded in towns and cities, reincarnation stories often intersect with documented historical narratives. Old buildings, graveyards, and preserved battlefields serve as daily reminders of earlier eras. When individuals describe memories aligned with these environments, such accounts gain attention because they appear to bridge the gap between lived experience and preserved history. The region's strong academic and archival institutions also mean that such stories are frequently subjected to scholarly scrutiny, reinforcing the perception that these beliefs are not confined to superstition, but engage with serious inquiry. The West Coast, shaped by migration, innovation, and cultural experimentation, offers yet another perspective. Communities there have historically been more open to alternative spiritual ideas, influenced by Eastern philosophies, countercultural movements, and a spirit of exploration. Reincarnation stories emerging in this context are often framed less as challenges to tradition and more as part of a broader exploration of consciousness. The region's openness allows such narratives to coexist with scientific and technological optimism, creating a space where unconventional ideas are discussed alongside empirical research. Indigenous communities across North America bring some of the oldest perspectives on cyclical existence and rebirth. Long before European settlement, many tribes held beliefs that emphasized continuity between generations, the return of spirits, and the interconnectedness of life. When stories resembling reincarnation arise within or near indigenous contexts, they are often understood not as anomalies, but as reaffirmations of long-held worldviews. These perspectives challenge linear notions of time introduced by Western thought, and offer an alternative framework in which past, present, and future are deeply intertwined. Immigrant communities have further enriched the American understanding of rebirth and continuity. Groups arriving from Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Europe brought with them traditions that included explicit teachings about reincarnation or ancestral return. As these communities settled and integrated, their beliefs influenced the broader cultural conversation. Children raised in multicultural environments sometimes expressed memories or ideas that reflected this blend, illustrating how cultural heritage can shape interpretations of unusual experiences without confining them to a single belief system. Urban centers, with their dense populations and constant exchange of ideas, have served as crossroads where these diverse perspectives meet. In cities, reincarnation stories are often shared through media, academic discussion, and public forums, reaching audiences far beyond their communities of origin. The anonymity and diversity of urban life allow such stories to be explored without the same social pressures found in smaller towns, fostering open debate and cross-cultural comparison. Rural regions, by contrast, often interpret these accounts through close-knit social structures where personal reputation and family history carry significant weight. In these settings, reincarnation stories can become part of local lore, discussed quietly within families or communities rather than broadcast widely. The intimacy of rural life means that details are often closely examined and inconsistencies quickly noticed, lending a different kind of credibility or skepticism to such narratives. Across regions, religious diversity has played a crucial role in shaping responses to reincarnation stories. Christian denominations, which dominate much of American religious life, have historically rejected reincarnation, yet individual believers sometimes reconcile these stories with personal faith through symbolic or metaphorical interpretations. Other religious traditions, including Buddhism and Hinduism, provide frameworks in which rebirth is an expected part of existence. The coexistence of these beliefs within a single nation creates a dynamic environment where ideas are constantly negotiated and reinterpreted. The spread of mass media has further blurred regional boundaries, allowing reincarnation stories from one part of the country to influence perceptions elsewhere. Television, books, and digital platforms have transformed local accounts into national conversations, encouraging Americans to compare experiences across cultural and geographic lines. This shared exposure has reinforced the sense that such stories are not confined to one group or belief system, but emerge repeatedly across the nation's diverse social fabric. Taken together, these regional and cultural variations reveal that reincarnation stories in the United States are not anomalies isolated to fringe communities. Instead, they appear within many cultural contexts, each shaping how the stories are told, understood, and evaluated. The repetition of similar themes across such a wide spectrum of American life suggests that questions about rebirth and continuity resonate broadly, reflecting a shared human curiosity expressed through the unique diversity of American society. American history has long been told as a story of forward motion, a narrative driven by progress, expansion, and the belief that each generation moves beyond the last. From the westward push of settlers to the rise of industry and technology, time is often portrayed as a straight line moving relentlessly ahead. Within this framework, identity is typically understood as something formed once, shaped by circumstance, choice, and opportunity, and then concluded at death. Reincarnation stories challenge this deeply ingrained assumption by suggesting that time and identity may not be as fixed or linear as traditionally believed. The American emphasis on individualism adds another layer to this challenge. The idea that each person defines their own path, independent of the past, is central to the national character. Self-made lives, reinvention, and fresh starts are celebrated themes. Yet stories in which individuals appear to carry memories, emotions, or unfinished business from previous lives complicate this vision. If aspects of identity persist across lifetimes, then the notion of starting entirely from scratch becomes less clear, raising questions about how much of who people are is inherited, remembered, or carried forward in ways not yet understood. History itself is often treated as something external, recorded in textbooks, monuments, and archives. Americans are taught to study the past in order to learn from it, but also to move beyond it. Reincarnation stories blur this boundary by implying that history may be internalized, lived again rather than simply remembered. When individuals demonstrate knowledge of past events without conventional learning, it challenges the idea that historical understanding is acquired solely through education and documentation. Instead, it suggests that experience and memory might interact with history in unexpected ways. The concept of justice is also affected by these stories. American legal and moral systems are built on the assumption of a single lifetime, where actions lead to consequences within that span. The possibility that life continues beyond one existence raises complex questions about accountability, responsibility, and moral growth. Some interpret reincarnation as a mechanism for balance, where experiences across lives contribute to learning and development. Others see it as a challenge to the finality that underpins many religious and legal traditions. Either way, the idea forces a reconsideration of how justice is understood over time. American culture has repeatedly shown a willingness to revisit and revise its understanding of reality. Scientific revolutions, social movements, and philosophical shifts have reshaped beliefs once considered settled. From accepting heliocentrism to acknowledging the complexities of human psychology, the nation's intellectual history is marked by moments when new evidence or perspectives transformed old assumptions. Reincarnation stories, while controversial, fit within this broader pattern of questioning and reevaluation. They invite inquiry rather than closure, encouraging dialogue between belief, skepticism, and open-minded investigation. The study of memory provides another lens through which these stories influence thinking about identity. Modern psychology recognizes that memory is not merely a recording device, but a dynamic process shaped by emotion, perception, and context. Yet the appearance of memories that seem disconnected from personal experience stretches existing theories. If memory can emerge without direct exposure, it suggests that the boundaries of the mind may be more complex than previously thought. This possibility has implications not only for understanding reincarnation claims, but also for broader questions about consciousness and the nature of selfhood. Cultural diversity within the United States further complicates interpretations of time and identity. Many traditions present in American society already view existence as cyclical rather than linear. Indigenous philosophies, Eastern religions, and certain spiritual movements emphasize continuity, return, and interconnectedness across generations. As these perspectives interact with mainstream American thought, they create a space where alternative understandings of life's trajectory can be considered without entirely abandoning established frameworks. Reincarnation stories often emerge at this intersection, reflecting a blending of ideas rather than a rejection of any single tradition. Education plays a critical role in shaping how these concepts are received. American schools teach history as a sequence of events, leading to the present, reinforcing linear time. Yet they also encourage critical thinking and questioning of assumptions. When students encounter stories that challenge conventional timelines, they are prompted to think more deeply about how knowledge is formed and what counts as evidence. This tension between structured learning and open inquiry mirrors the broader national conversation surrounding reincarnation and related phenomena. Public discourse around these stories often reveals as much about cultural values as it does about the stories themselves. Skeptics emphasize rational explanation and the importance of empirical proof, reflecting a commitment to scientific reasoning. Supporters highlight patterns, emotional depth, and unexplained accuracy, appealing to a sense of wonder and curiosity. The coexistence of these responses illustrates an American tendency to hold competing ideas in balance, allowing debate without demanding immediate resolution. The persistence of reincarnation stories in American culture suggests that they fulfill a deeper need to understand continuity in a rapidly changing world. As technology accelerates and social structures evolve, questions about what remains constant become increasingly urgent. The possibility that identity extends beyond a single lifetime offers one way of addressing this uncertainty, providing a sense of connection across time and experience. Ultimately, these stories encourage a reconsideration of how history is lived and remembered. Rather than viewing the past solely as something that happened to others, they invite reflection on the possibility that the past may be more intimately connected to the present than commonly assumed. In doing so, they challenge Americans to rethink not only the nature of time and identity, but also the relationship between personal experience and the larger historical narrative in which every life is embedded across the sweep of American history, from its earliest spiritual debates to its modern fascination with consciousness and memory. The question of whether life is confined to a single span has never fully disappeared. The stories explored throughout this speech do not demand blind belief, nor do they fit neatly within established doctrines or scientific models. Instead, they occupy a thoughtful middle ground where documented history, personal memory, and cultural tradition intersect. They remind us that the American experience has always been shaped by a willingness to question accepted limits, to examine evidence closely, and to remain open to possibilities that challenge comfortable assumptions. These accounts invite reflection on how history itself is understood, not merely as dates and events recorded in books, but as lived experience that may echo in unexpected ways. They suggest that memory could be more than a product of individual learning, that identity might not be entirely erased by death, and that the past may exert a quieter, more personal influence on the present than commonly acknowledged. Whether viewed through the lens of psychology, culture, or spiritual inquiry, such stories encourage humility in the face of what is not yet fully explained. In a nation built on curiosity, reinvention, and the constant re-examination of truth, these narratives serve as reminders that the search for understanding is ongoing. They do not close the debate, they deepen it, urging careful thought rather than easy answers. By engaging with these stories thoughtfully, Americans continue a long tradition of exploring the boundaries of knowledge, history, and human experience, leaving us with one enduring question that still lingers long after the final word is spoken. What if the story of a life does not truly end where we have always assumed it does?